On a September evening, over a war-torn Belgian countryside, a legendary dogfight was about to ensue. On one side would be the elite B and C flights from 56 Squadron Royal Flying Corps. On the other, a lone German aviator who would fight them off for nearly 10 minutes. Facing no fewer than 6 Royal Flying Corps aces, who, among them, would amass 170 victories by war's end, was Lieutenant Werner Voss. Flying in a newly introduced Fokker DR1, in a converted V4 prototype no less, Voss would display unrivaled flying prowess, which even his fellow ace, James McCudden, would celebrate in his personal diary. Nevertheless, while managing to evade the concentrated fire of up to 5 SE-5As at one time, a single burst eventually disabled the daredevil German pilot. Taking advantage of the level flying tripe, Lieutenant Arthur Rhys-Davies swoops in for the coup de grace and sends the DR1 to the ground. The triplane disintegrates as it crashes nose first into the ground, and within days, the news comes. Werner Voss is dead, with 48 aerial victories to his name at the tender age of just 20 years old. After the fight, the mood in the 56 Squadron mess is somber. B and C flights are trying to process what they've just lived through. Voss had managed to disable 4 SE-5As during the fight, 2 of which were from 56 Squadron itself. Lieutenant Cronin, a Canadian volunteer, receives news from his ground crew that his kite is a complete write-off and could very nearly have broken up in flight. He spends a sleepless night sweating and pondering his lucky escape. When Rhys-Davies, who is eventually credited with the victory, hears of Voss's fate, he turns to his flight leader McCudden and with emotion in his voice utters, "Oh, if only I could have brought him down alive." Almost 7 months later, when Manfred Von Richthofen is shot down by Australian ground fire, the Irish ace, Edward Manock, is heard to say, "I hope the bastard sizzled all the way down." When you look at the lives and wartime careers of Werner Voss and Manfred Von Richthofen, there are both similarities and stark differences. It's indisputable that MVR would end the war as the top-scoring ace, an achievement that would not be beaten until June 1941 by Werner Mulders. But was Von Richthofen a better pilot and aerial fighter than Voss? Had the younger man lived longer, would his final score have outstripped his friend and rival? Let's talk about that. It would be simple just to say that Von Richthofen managed to shoot down 32 more enemy aircraft than Voss, which made him the most successful fighter pilot. I wanted to see if this was actually true and if other figures could back that up. It's almost impossible to compare the lives and wartime careers of two men accurately and without some bias. They were not the same people. They had different experiences in the air, different approaches to combat, flew different aircraft at times, and served for the most part in different units. While I do recognise all that, I'm going to conveniently forget it and just talk about stats I've compiled myself and use them to suggest some counterfactual history here. So let's quickly establish a timeline for each of our German pilots and then break down just how relatively successful they were in the air war. Both Voss and Von Richthofen started their wars on the ground, each joining the cavalry. In 1915 they also each joined the Air Force, or Fliegertruppen as it was known then, initially as observers before undergoing pilot training. After successfully completing this, they also both flew in two-seater reconnaissance or bomber aircraft before going to Einsatzschule and being selected to join Jasta 2 in 1916. Von Richthofen joined Oswald Boelcke's fighter squadron on the 1st of September and scored his first aerial victory, an FE-2B, on the 17th of the same month. Likely this was because the new squadron didn't receive its full strength of Albatros fighters until the day before. Voss joined the same squadron a couple of months later on the 21st of November and would score his first and second victories within 5 days of his arrival, a Newport 17 on the morning of the 27th of November and a British pusher type in the afternoon. At this point, MVR's tally was 10 official victories. Both pilots would go on to join and lead other squadrons as the war progressed. Von Richthofen would be shot down while the leader of JG1 on the 21st of April 1918, and Voss was killed at the helm of Jasta 10, part of MVR's fighter wing, on the evening of the 23rd of September 1917. This means that all told, MVR was active as a fighter pilot for approximately 598 days, while Voss flew single-seaters for the Luftstreitkräfte for 307 days. This number is a rough total and doesn't account for the days away from the front for injury or leave, of which the two shared together at least once. This is where the maths starts to get interesting and can perhaps help us answer the question, which pilot was deadlier and relatively more successful? When you look at the official list of victories, where MVR is credited with 80 enemy aircraft downed and Voss 48, we see that Von Richthofen claimed victories on 63 individual days and Voss on 35. This means that MVR claimed at least one victory on 10.54% of the days he was active. Voss managed a victory on at least 11.4% days of his service of duty. Voss also managed multiple victories on at least 11 days, either double or triple claims. MVR managed the same feat on 13 days, including 4 claims on the 29th of April 1917. When you break down the daily kill ratio, MVR managed an average of 0.13 enemy aircraft per day and Voss 0.16 per day. These numbers are rounded up, but generally Voss was shooting down a British or French aircraft every 6 days and Von Richthofen was killing Englanders at a rate of 1 per week. But of course, their victories came in concentrations and often with days of numerous inconclusive combats in between. Again, if we imagine that all the conditions that these two men faced could be strictly controlled and made identical, would Voss have pipped MVR to the post of being the top scoring ace of World War I? If we say that somehow Voss and Von Richthofen would have fallen on the same day, the 21st of April 1918, I calculate that Voss would have shot down 80 or perhaps 81 aircraft with the daily ratio previously mentioned. If we give Voss the full 598 days that spanned Von Richthofen's fighter career, having him join Jasta 2 nearly 2 months earlier, he may have managed to shoot down 93 or even 94 aircraft. But this was never to be. Instead, Voss was to fall 211 days before Von Richthofen, and unlike his former squadron mate, he received a hurried funeral in a shell hole, and his grave's location was subsequently lost in heavy fighting. Now, it is possible that another pilot had an even more impressive daily kill ratio. So if you know a better candidate, feel free to let me know in the comments and give the video a like if you appreciate this line of questioning. As fun as it is to play around with counterfactual history, a single pilot was not going to change the course of the Great War. Squadrons, air wings and air forces had a better chance. So when comparing these two fighter aces, it's important to talk about how well they fought alongside their fellow pilots. Manfred von Richthofen is often described as the heir to the great fighter tactician Oswald Boelcke. Von Richthofen would take on board what he was taught in those early months at Jasta 2, and he applied those lessons to the rest of his career as a fighter pilot. Voss, perhaps due to the time of his arrival, didn't seem to take the dicta Boelcke as much to heart. With the death of Boelcke on the 28th of October 1916, Voss never actually flew under his command. It's been suggested that the two did know each other, given the locality of their squadrons in early 1916, and the fact that a signed photo of Boelcke made it into the Voss family collection. Manfred von Richthofen often comes across as a cold and earnest tactician who only fought when the odds were in his favour. Almost the perfect fighter pilot. Voss was very much of the Albert Bull school of thought. Hit the enemy wherever you found him and hit him hard. If there were more of them than you, so much the better. While Voss seemed to like to improvise, von Richthofen liked to keep to the battle plan and avoid unnecessary deviations. Voss also seemed content to hunt the enemy alone. This was very much at odds with von Richthofen, who, as the war progressed, usually kept his Jasta together as a cohesive fighting force when possible. Indeed, even on the day of his death, after takeoff, Voss climbed above and away from his two wingmen, Lieutenants Bellin and Rudenberg, leaving them to hunt alone. In a war where the Luftstreitkräfte was fighting a growing Royal Flying Corps and Aviation militaire, though Voss didn't think much of the Frenchmen, getting the most out of your squadrons was key. Upon taking his first command, MVR instilled a sense of pride and desire to succeed in his Jasta 11 pilots. He taught them the tactics he had been taught by Boelcke in a time where air strategy was in its infancy, and then led from the front to show how those tactics should be applied. Voss, despite his almost unrivaled prowess as a fighter pilot, was reportedly a pretty lousy leader. Sent to command Jasta 5, then 29 and 14, each one a shorter posting than the last, he eventually ended up leading Jasta 10. Not interested in the administrative side of his commands, which he left to Oberleutnant Weigand, Voss spent as much time in the air as he could. It's perhaps fair to say that successive losses of Staffelführer pushed Voss to the top of the list, where possibly he was best suited as a section leader at most. He also had very limited appreciation of the wider air war. When asked to compile a report about fighter tactics and their use against the enemy as the newly appointed Jasta 10 commander, he failed miserably. His report apparently only addressed the view of an individual fighter pilot and was fairly naive in other respects. Still, Voss was only 20 years old and perhaps still young despite his stellar wartime performance to date. Moreover, when contact with the enemy was made, Voss reportedly only focused on the prize and forgot his duty to lead and encourage other squadron members. Often, novice pilots were completely abandoned by the Rhinelander, and more than one must have fallen to the Allied guns in his absence. Was this a question of age, or was it personality? Perhaps the industrialist son from Krefeld didn't have the innate qualities of leadership the aristocratic von Richthofen seemed to possess. Whatever it was, Jaster 10 seemingly wasn't as an effective force as Jaster 11 had been under the command of MVR. Feel free to let me know your thoughts on Voss as a leader in the comment section below. The two most important criteria for a successful fighter pilot are probably excellent gunnery skills and complete mastery of your aircraft. Both Voss and von Richthofen could claim to meet each of these. That being said, Voss seemed to be one of those people who just took to flying from day one. Von Richthofen was reportedly a lousy trainee and probably only remained a fairly average pilot, if quite an experienced one, until his death. Even at the height of his fame, MVR managed to crash a perfectly serviceable aircraft when attempting to land next to his latest victim, a British two-seater which had made a smooth landing despite being in flames. In aerial combat, if you can kill your enemy before he knows you're there, then you never need to outfly him. Both Voss and MVR seem to have this ability, and Voss's combat reports in particular often make for very brief reading. It's been claimed that Voss had the ability to bring down an aircraft with surgeon-like precision, only shooting the engine and avoiding the crew. However, this is more than likely exaggerated. Even for a gifted marksman, it's hard to land bullets in exactly the right place at relatively high closing speeds. Bluntly, both men were killers, though sometimes reluctantly so. Von Richthofen knew that targeting an enemy gunner then made the two-seater easier meat, and Voss was known to strafe down enemy aircraft on more than one occasion, even when they landed in German-held territory. In fact, Francis Don, the air attaché to the British Embassy in Berlin during the 1930s, and also a pilot of an FE-2B who was the victim of just such an attack, refused point-blank to meet Voss's sister, Margaret Rose, at her request. He still remembered the bullet in his leg that her brother had given him 20 years earlier. It is Voss who is most associated with excellent flying skills, not least due to his performance on the 23rd of September 1917. However, the fight he had with 56 Squadron was not the first time he managed to engage multiple enemies with visible ease. On the 16th of November 1916, while flying with 29 Squadron, James McCudden and 4 other DH-2 pilots were pounced on by a lone Halberstadt fighter. For several minutes, the German pilot engaged the British pushers and easily dodged their fire. It is rumoured this was none other than Voss. At the time, he was still on probation as a fighter pilot, had little experience in fighters, and was actually awaiting his posting to Jaster 2 in 5 days. In the 10 months that followed, his flying skills only seemed to improve. When you read the eyewitness reports of the 56 Squadron pilots who fought him over Belgium on that September evening, they are filled with admiration for his flying. McCudden couldn't quite describe how he was able to throw his Fokker DR-1 around in quite the way he did, casually kicking the rudder bar to give a SE-5 a squirt here and another burst there without losing control in flat spins and near horizontal skids. Captain Hammersley and Lieutenant Chidlaw Roberts, pilots of 60 Squadron, who were to meet him first in combat that evening, were equally impressed. Voss seemed to have little trouble flicking onto each one of their tails, and soon sent the 2 SE-5As packing. Von Richthofen, who certainly shot down his fair share of fighters in single combat, never got quite the same praise for raw flying skill. That being said, before news reached 56 Squadron of Voss's fate, MVR was top of their list for the German they had just encountered. As I mentioned before, I don't think that an individual's victory tally makes that much of a difference in the totality of a world war. However, individual pilots have indeed changed the course of warfare for their own sides. A good example of this is the Miracle of the Marne, where Allied reconnaissance aircraft discovered a huge gap in the line of the advancing Germans in 1914. During my research, a question popped up. Did Voss, a self-confident and gifted teenage pilot, seek out single-seat fighters to further his own glory? And did von Richthofen shy away from this aerial form of jousting and focus on the real prize, bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, because they were usually obsolete and easier pickings? So I went back to the maths to see if I could figure this out. When you go through the official victory list of both Voss and Von Richthofen, there is certainly a different ratio of scout to two-seater kills. MVR managed to shoot down 36 single-seaters to 44 two-seaters, a 45-55% split. Voss shot down 23 fighters and 25 bomber or reconnaissance aircraft, so roughly a 48-52% split. So I would say that there is no statistical evidence that Voss only went after fighters. It's also true to say that attacking two-seaters could be deadly, seeing that they could fire back at you in a way fighters couldn't. The truth is that during the Great War, fighter pilots of both sides only really had two jobs: make sure that the enemy could not gather intelligence or interfere with your own troops, and ensure that your own two-seater crews could do just that to the enemy. As the German fighters operated almost exclusively over their own territory, the target was always the two-seaters. Another interesting story associated with Voss and Von Richthofen was whether or not they were hostile rivals in the race to be the top-scoring German ace. The fact that each pilot was aware of and eager to increase his tally of victories is beyond a doubt. Not only did Germany publicise its fighter aces more than the British, Von Richthofen was known to collect silver cups celebrating each of his kills. Voss, who joined Jasta 2 just 2 days before MVR's legendary fight with British ace Leno Hawker, must have been equally swept up in this culture. It's been suggested that Von Richthofen was intimidated by the young pilot's swift accumulation of victories, and even arranged for him to be sent on leave or posted to non-combat assignments whenever Voss's score threatened his own. Now, I haven't sat down and matched absence from the front with relative scores. If you can provide that information in the comments, that would be fantastic. That being said, it is interesting that Voss made only 2 claims during the period that MVR had his most successful run of victories, Bloody April 1917. I can only assume Voss was absent from the front or in a quieter section of it. What is clear is that the two men were friendly. At least once they departed on leave together, and Von Richthofen even visited Voss's family in Krefeld before his death. There were also rumours of a romantic interest between MVR and a Voss sister. Voss, though more than likely on good terms with his former Jasta 2 squadron mate, was not awestruck by the Baron. He once remarked that, as good as Von Richthofen was, he was no better than I. Whatever conclusions you come to, I think we can safely say that both Voss and Von Richthofen were remarkable men in their own right. While both men would die months before the end of such a tragic war, their aerial contribution would stand until the armistice. Von Richthofen will always remain the top-scoring fighter pilot of World War I, while Voss remains in the top 20 overall and is the 5th highest-scoring German ace of the war. In the 14 months that followed his death, only 4 Germans would surpass his score. If you've enjoyed the video and you've got this far, why not give the video a like to help it spread to more people? Let me know your own opinions in the comments section. And if you're interested in World War I fighter aces, why not watch the video on screen for you right now?